In this lecture, I'm going to talk about some of the key themes and ideas to be found in Jean-Paul Sartre's mammoth book, Being in Nothingness. A huge book, more than 800 pages. And of course, in the time we have allotted to us, we can't talk about all the intricacies and arguments that he makes in that book. What I'm hoping to do is provide you with a kind of a toolkit of ideas taken from this book that you can use in formulating your own philosophy of life, which we'll talk about a little bit later on in the course. So again, we're just going to be scratching the surface of this big book, and I hope that you'll find some things of interest to you in it. So the first thing I want to go over is a bit of a review, this idea of consciousness and what Sartre calls being for itself. So let's just take a simple conscious act, for instance, being conscious of some object, let's say an apple. You're conscious of an apple, you're aware of an apple, you're looking at an apple, you're thinking about an apple, you're having some sort of conscious act. And as we know, we learned before, all consciousness is consciousness of something. So in this particular case, what your conscious act is conscious of is the apple. Now, suppose I interrupt you and I say, hey, what are you doing? And you say, well, I was thinking about an apple. Well, what do you think about now? Now you have a new conscious act going on. You don't have the act of being conscious of the apple. I've asked you a question, and you are responding to my question. You're thinking about an apple. That's different from thinking about an apple. You hear that? So you're thinking about yourself thinking about the apple. So you've become an object of consciousness. Now you're the object. What's your conscious act about? It's about me. It's about my consciousness, about my thinking, or about my awareness. So how's that possible? Before I interrupted you, you were just thinking about the apple. You weren't thinking of yourself thinking about an apple. You were thinking about the apple. That was it. Until I disrupted that conscious act by questioning you and saying, hey, what are you doing? Well, Sartre says, well, that's possible because every consciousness has sort of two elements to it. The first, the one that I think we could all guess pretty easily, he labels positional or thetic consciousness of the object. Now, what do those words mean? Positional. Well, it means to posit something. I posit that there's an apple there that I'm thinking about. Or thetic comes from the same word where we get thesis. When I say, what's the thesis of your paper? I'm asking, well, what's it about? Well, positional or thetic consciousness of an object is just what that consciousness is about, an apple. Or, of course, when I interrupted you, about you thinking about the apple as an object. But at the same time, Sartre says there has to be what he calls now non-positional or non-thetic consciousness of self. Every time you're conscious of an apple, that's what you're conscious of. That's the content of your consciousness. That's what you're positing. That's the thesis, so to speak, of your consciousness. But at the same time, there must be this non-thetic consciousness of self, this non-positional consciousness of self. Why? Because if there weren't, and I asked you what you were doing, you would have to say, well, I got no idea, because I've moved on to a new conscious act and left the other one behind, whatever that was. But of course that doesn't happen. You're aware of your awareness. It's not the content of your awareness at the time, but you can make it the object of your awareness. All right? Sartre thinks there's a real key to something in this recognition. So if you think about it, what was Descartes doing? He had made himself the object of a conscious act. He went through that whole process that we talked about. He was going to doubt any possible source of knowledge, and anything that survived that withering doubt, that methodological doubt, that he could have clear and distinct in his mind, that for him would be a certainty. And one of the things he believed he was certain of then is that he was aware of the ego cogito, the I think of himself as a thinking thing. That's what he decided that he was. And we talked about how that was one kind of substantial being, and there was another kind of substantial being, extended substance, and all the problems of having that dualism in philosophy, and how that's an object of criticism of the existentialists. Well, Here's why. Sartre says that, yes, you can make yourself an object of consciousness, but that object of your conscious act at that time does not 100% correspond to the consciousness that you are. Because if I say, well, what are you doing now? Well, I'm thinking about myself, right? And somebody comes in and interrupts us, and asks you, what are you doing? Well, I'm thinking about myself. Well, now what are you doing? Well, I'm thinking about you, thinking about myself, thinking about myself. There's always something that escapes, that's always behind every conscious act, that in a way has no object. It takes objects. It can't be without objects, but that non-thetic, non-positional consciousness of self always escapes any objectification of the self. So let me put it in simpler terms. His takeaway from this is going to be that, in fact, however you conceive yourself, however you objectify yourself, however others objectify you, which we'll talk about, there's always something about you that's free of that. That's free of that. And that is the subjective consciousness that Sartre's going to name radical freedom. But that radical freedom is its own kind of nothingness. It's a transcendence. It transcends any objectification. Anytime you're sitting in deep philosophical thought saying, who am I and what is myself and what am I all about? How you answer those questions, as important and as meaningful as those questions might be, there's always something that escapes that boundary or limitation that you're putting on yourself to make a self. The self is a construct, Sartre's going to say. It gets constructed both by myself and importantly by others. But what Sartre calls being for itself, or transcendence, or radical freedom, that is a kind of nothingness. It's a nothingness. It's in the sense not that it's zero, more like no-thingness, if you could say it to yourself like that. No-thingness. The thing that you are is really not a thing. You could objectify yourself and talk about yourself as if you were a thing, and others can do the same as well, but there's always something that escapes that, a kind of a radical freedom. And that's going to be the key to understanding Sartre's, especially Sartre's early existentialist points of view. Now, there's a section in Being Nothingness called the Ontological Proof. Now, you might have in your other philosophical or theological classes run across that term, the ontological proof, from St. Anselm. And St. Anselm meant it as a proof of the existence of God from the nature of God's being, which is different from the nature of any other being, with a big B. It kind of works like this. God is that in which nothing greater can be conceived. An actually existing greatest being would be greater than an idea only in the mind of a greatest being. So the greatest conceivable being would have to exist necessarily by its own ontological nature. That's not true of anything else. So I could think of a great pile of gold. Well, is that the greatest conceivable thing? Well, I can think of a greater pile of gold, right? Well, what would be even greater than that? Not just the idea of this big, great pile of gold, but gold that's in my bank account in that amount. That'd be great. That would be even greater. But that is not the definition of gold, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Anselm thinks even an atheist, when an atheist says, I don't believe in God, the atheist is saying, Anselm says, I don't believe that there is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And Anselm says the minute you admit that, which you have to admit, he thinks he's got you. Now, that's a discussion for another day, whether that ontological proof of God's existence is open to criticism and whether you find it plausible or not. But Sartre means it differently. Here he's talking about the proof of the existence of things outside the mind, what he calls being in itself. And the proof of things outside the mind is based on the nature of consciousness. And it goes back to that idea that every consciousness is consciousness of something. And the something of which consciousness is conscious is being. He's after Descartes, right? He's after Descartes. He thinks that consciousness discloses being in itself. It discloses that just is what it is, that kind of being. Descartes always worried, well, I have a clear and distinct idea of extension, but is it based in anything? Is there really anything out there? Are there really other minds out there? Sartre's having none of that. As much as he likes to start with consciousness like Descartes does, he's a good Frenchman after all, he thinks Descartes totally missed the boat. That if you accept the idea that consciousness is consciousness of something, that all consciousness has a positional or aesthetic content, then you don't have to prove the world consciousness could not be if it didn't have an object, and the object of consciousness is being. He calls it, you'll run across this term, transphenomenal being. And that just means, going beyond any possible appearing. So yeah, things appear, so to speak, in consciousness. They show up, they're a phenomenon, they show up, but they're not limited just to their showing up. That's what he means by transphenomenal being. Being in itself. Being just is. Whether you're perceiving it or not. It just is. And consciousness, he thinks, the nature of consciousness proves what Descartes would refer to as the external world. So, again, trying to get rid of Descartes' bad dualist modernist philosophy. He writes, Sartre does, that consciousness is born supported by a being which is not itself. That goes along hand in hand with Heidegger's idea that Dasein is being in the world. Doesn't happen to be in the world like coffee happens to be in my coffee cup. The world and Dasein are two sides of the same coin. And Sartre's saying the same thing here. Now, I want to give us two more terms to put in your toolkit. One of them is the idea of Gestalt. And the other is a term that comes up in Sartre's work all the time, nihilation, which, maybe that doesn't sound good, but let's see what he means. So let's talk about Gestalt first. Good word to know. So it comes from the German for form or shape, and it refers to an organized whole, a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. It's about, and this is key, this is what you want to remember, it's about figure and ground. And I'll give you examples of this to see what we're talking about. It's about figure and ground. And because it's about this interrelationship between figure and ground in the whole, it leads to a kind of ambiguity. The figure is what it is because the ground is what it is, and vice versa. So the idea is change the figure and it changes the ground. Change the ground and the figure against which it appears will also change. So here's a kind of a famous example. Maybe you've seen this. So we'll look at this together. What do you see? What do you see in this picture? Take a moment. Take a look at the picture. Now, some people would say, well, what I see is kind of a vase. Here's the top of the vase. It's nice, here's the base of the vase down here. And, it's got a nice little design to it and everything. You could put flowers in the top or whatever, but it's a vase. Other people look at this and they say, no, it's not a vase. What I see are two silhouettes of faces facing each other. So here's the forehead and the eye and the eyebrow and the nose and the lips and the chin of one figure. And here's the forehead and the nose and the lips and the chin of the other figure. And they're coming, maybe they're coming close together or having an intimate conversation, or maybe they're about to kiss or whatever. Couple things to remark about this. If I change the shape of the vase, I change the shape of the faces. If I change the shape of the faces, I change the shape of the vase. I can't affect one without affecting the other. The second thing to point out is you can only see one of these two options at a time. I'm not doubting that you can see both, maybe now that I've pointed them out to you especially. I'm not saying you can't see both. What I am saying is if you're looking at the vase, you can't be seeing the faces. If you're looking at the faces, you can't be seeing the vase. If I took away the faces altogether, we just have one big black field. If I took away the vase, we would just have one big white field. We have a vase because of the white field. We have the two faces because of the black field. but you can't see them both at the same time. So figure and ground is important. Why do you see one rather than another? Well, that is the question, isn't it? Why one rather than the other? Because you can't say, well, what that is a vase and not faces, or what that is are two faces and not a vase. You can't say that. It's how you're looking at it. So take another example. How about this one? What do you see in this picture? Take a minute, take a good look at it, think it over. What do you see there? What do you see in this picture? Well, let's look at it a little bit. Maybe what you see is what looks like an older woman. Here's her left eye, and here's the bridge of her nose. She's got kind of a big nose. Here's her nose. And here's her mouth, and her chin is tucked down in her fur stole there that she has. She's wearing a babushka up here, and she's looking this direction, looking in this direction here. There's her eye. And there's her other eyelid over here. And that's her nose, and that's her eye, and her mouth, and she's looking this way. Here's her nostril. Right? Maybe that's what you see. Or maybe what you see is what looks to be maybe a young woman. A young woman. Do you see a young woman there? Well, here would be her left ear. Here would be her jawline. And here would be her mouth. Here's her cheek. And here's her eyelash and her little nose. And she's looking this direction, sort of off this way, where she's looking over her right shoulder, kind of away from us. And here's her ear, again, and her jawline and her cheek and her little nose as she looks out this way, and she's wearing a nice hat. Well, take a look. Maybe you see the old woman, maybe you see the young woman, but again, you can't see both. And if I were to adjust the older woman's nose, I would be adjusting the younger woman's cheek. If I were to adjust the younger woman's ear, I would be adjusting the older woman's left eye. If I were to adjust the mouth of the older woman, I would be adjusting the choker necklace that the young woman is wearing in her neck, right here. And here's her down towards her chest. And you can only see one of those at a time. Maybe now that I've pointed it out, you've been able to see both, but the fact is you can only see one at a time. So which is it? Is it a young woman? Is it an old woman? We pass it off as an optical illusion, but it illustrates something fundamentally important. One figure is the ground of the other ground is the figure of the other. And you can't see one without seeing, you can only see one by what Sartre's going to say is annihilating elements of being. Because Sartre's going to argue what there is being. Being in itself is what it is. And left to its own devices, it would just be one big glop of being. But we don't experience the world as one big glop of being. We experience the world as things, as figures on grounds, in a Gestalt kind of manner. And how we do that is something that's a function of consciousness. So Sartre brings up this idea of négatités, and that's a French word that's kind of made up by Sartre, neologism, and it doesn't translate into any kind of recognizable English word either. So we'll just leave it at that. And what it refers to is instances of voids or lacks or absences in one way or another. And this idea of Gestalt shows how consciousness annihilates. Now, that sounds negative, right? Because we've talked about nihilism, and the word to annihilate something is to reduce it to nothing, to reduce it to zero. Well, it's actually productive. If consciousness didn't annihilate, there would be no conscious experience at all. There just wouldn't be anything. It wouldn't be a world. Being in itself, that which just is what it is, cannot be annihilated as such, because being just is. It is. That's it. Nothing you can do about that. But what Sartre's saying is regions of being in itself, the stuff that just is what it is, regions of that limited regions of that can be annihilated, and are annihilated all the time. That process of annihilation allows there to be a this in the first place, insofar as it's not a that, insofar as it's not a that. You can hear the negative there. To be able to capture a this, you have to have it recognized as not that. To have the young woman, it's not the old woman. To have the vase, it's not the two faces. Right. A very famous example from being in nothingness is Pierre or Peter's not being in the cafe. Sartre gives an example. He says, here's what I'm talking about. Suppose I have an appointment to meet my friend Pierre at a cafe where we always meet. Pierre is always prompt. I'm running late. And when I get to the cafe, I'm worried that Pierre will not have waited for me. It's an example that illustrates this idea of annihilation and nothingness. Where does it come from? What is it? Heidegger, by the way, seems to equate nothingness, what we're talking about here, with death. And I just want to point out that neither Beauvoir nor Sartre does equate it with death. For Heidegger, death is the great possibility of no more possibilities, of nothingness, the abyss over which we live our lives. Sartre and Beauvoir says nothingness is with us, through and through. It's a feature of consciousness, and without it, there would be no human experience of anything. So what he talks about in this example is he gets to the cafe and he looks around and he's looking for Pierre, and he doesn't see him. He doesn't see Pierre in the cafe. And he's asking, like, what's going on there? How can I see that Pierre's not there? And that's the way we talk. I saw he wasn't there. Now, how can you see something that's not? Right? It's a good question. How do you see what's not? You can see what is. But he says, no, I saw that he was not there. Pierre wasn't there. I saw it. I sensed it. I experienced his not being there. And he talks about that. He says, is that just a matter of language? He says, no, the cafe is just chock full of being in itself. There's, the bar and bar stools and bottles and glasses and other patrons and the floor and the jukebox over in the corner and the lights and the ceiling. There's all kinds of being there and not Pierre. And that bar, that cafe, is the ground that the figure of Pierre's absence appears in. Right? We consciousness makes Pierre's not being there experienceable. That's the way consciousness works. So what Sartre's trying to say is that even though being in itself just is what it is, it's infected by nothingness. And he's going to say being is infected by nothingness, that nothingness is real, if you want to put it that way, because there's consciousness. It's consciousness that does that. And he says, look, there's a lot of people who, if I'm going to meet my friend Pierre, well, guess who's not there? I mean, LeBron James is not in the cafe, and Beyonce is not in the cafe, and lots of people aren't in the cafe, but that's not what I'm experiencing. I'm experiencing Pierre's not being in the cafe. It doesn't mean Pierre has no being. He's somewhere. I don't know where he is. Maybe he got back on the bus and he left or whatever. He's back home, walking down the street, wherever. It's not like he has no being, but through the process of consciousness and what Sartre calls annihilation, against the ground of the cafe, I'm able to experience Pierre's not being there. And look, the same process of annihilation would be going on if Peter were in the cafe. I walk in and there's just being, there's just all kinds of stuff, but it all becomes for me a ground against which the figure of my friend Pierre jumps out at me. There he is. I'm going to go give him a hug. There's my buddy Pierre. We're going to have our coffee and talk philosophy. Pierre's not being in the cafe is a function of my expectation. Like I said, I didn't expect LeBron or Beyonce. I'd have been very surprised if they jumped out of the background of the cafe. I expected Pierre to be there. He wasn't there. So I experience not where he is, but his not being there is something that it's a function of my expectation. Sartre writes, non-being does not come to things by a negative judgment. So in other words, not just my saying so. It is the negative judgment, Pierre's not here, statement, claim, on the contrary, which is conditioned and supported by non-being, and non-being infects being because of consciousness, right? Where does it come from? That's what he's asking. And the first thing he comes up with is the idea that consciousness, in a way, can be thought of as a constant stream of questioning. Now, maybe we don't experience ourselves as constantly asking questions, constantly asking, well, why this or what is that really? But when we make claims, where we say this is that, or that's good, or this is over here, you could look at it like we are answering the question, is this good? Is that over here? Right? We could look at our claims, our affirmations, as a function of our questioning. But questioning, Sartre says, always leaves open the possibility of a negative answer, of not having our expectations satisfied. So he writes, it is essential, therefore, that the questioner have the permanent possibility of dissociating himself or herself from the causal series which constitutes being and which can produce only being. What do all those words mean? It's like we were talking about with Heidegger's notion of existence, that existere, that ability to stand out from being and take a stance towards being and have expectations towards being and ask questions about being based on my concerns, my cares. That's got to be a permanent possibility of the kind of being that we are. So he continues, by a double movement of nihilation, he annihilates the thing question in relation to himself by placing it in a neutral state between being and non-being, and that he annihilates himself in relation to the thing question by wrenching himself from being in order to be able to bring out of himself the possibility of a non-being. Thus, in posing a question, a certain negative element is introduced into the world. We see nothingness making the world iridescent, casting a shimmer over things. But at the same time, the question emanates from a questioner who, in order to motivate himself in his being as one who questions, disengages himself from being, the being in itself, the stuff that just is what it is. This disengagement is then, by definition, a human process. Man presents himself, at least in this instance, as a being who causes nothingness to arise in the world, inasmuch as he himself is affected with non-being to this end. The title, Being and Nothingness, when I talk about this book in other courses where I can only just really kind of reference it, I can't really say much about the book, I say, look, quick quiz. Sartre writes a book called Being and Nothingness. One of those two words is about you. Which one is it? Right? And people's first response is, well, being, that's about me. I'm a being. I am, and nothingness, that can't be about me. And I say, gotcha, because Sartre is trying to say fundamentally what you are is consciousness, a being for itself, a transcendence, and transcendence is no-thingness. It brings in this annihilating possibility into being that allows there to be consciousness and experience at all. Without that, there would be no experience of the world whatsoever. There would just be one big blob of is what it is. So this can lead us to some questions, and I'll just put them out here now, and maybe we could think about them together. Do I hope to find myself? These lectures are in conjunction with college courses, and a lot of times it's not always, of course, but a lot of times it's younger persons, and we all like to say, well, I'm really trying to find myself. That would be great if I could just figure out, who I am and just find myself. Okay, are we here to fill a role? Are we here to fill some kind of a void? I'm born in the world, and there's a me-shaped hole in reality that's just waiting for me to get to that place and plug myself in like it's a piece in a jigsaw puzzle. That's where I would find myself. I'd find my place in the world. I'd find myself, and I'd find my place in the world. Now, let those questions percolate. We'll come back to those really at the end of the course, but let me just put this other one out there. Did the smartphone come into existence to fill a need? Or was the need generated by the existence of the smartphone? Did the smartphone come into existence to fill a need? Were people sitting around going, it'd be great if I had this gadget that I could put in my pocket and it would be connected to the internet and I could text people and I could take little TikTok videos of me dancing and I could throw them up there for the world to see in social media. That's, if I just could carry that deal around, that'd be great. But, there isn't any such thing like that. I really need that. Somebody ought to make that. Or did somebody make one of those things that could do those things, and out of the existence of that smartphone, generate somehow a felt need in all of us? And you know how it is. Let's be honest. It's pretty hard to put our phones down, so we feel like we need them. We feel like you took our phone away for a while. We go through withdrawal symptoms. Where do those things come from? Right. I think the third question is related to the first two. All right. So about some more possibilities. Sartre, like Heidegger, thinks that what Heidegger calls Dasein, what Sartre calls the for itself or transcendence, is about possibilities. So it gives some examples, and one thing you got to give Sartre credit for. My 2 cents worth. I don't think Sartre's big book, Being in Nothingness, I think it's a great and worthy book. I don't. It's my opinion. I don't believe that it's written with the same kind of precision as Heidegger's Being in Time. For all of Heidegger's neologisms, it's a very logical, structured work, which I hope I was able to convey. Sartre, he's got some really interesting ideas, and he's got arguments, and he tries to back it up, but sometimes he kind of gets loose with the way he talks about things. But the one thing you got to give Sartre credit for is he has a ton of examples. Heidegger had a few, right? Using the hammer, and what does that, tell us about ourselves? And, what about when everybody's, reading the newspaper, what does that do? He had a couple of examples. Sartre's books are chock full of examples. And that's what you would expect from somebody who not only, writes big philosophical tomes, but writes novels and plays and essays meant for just a reading public. So he does give us a lot of examples. So what I want to talk about now are just a few of the very famous examples that Sartre gives, and again, with the idea of trying to give you some tools for your toolkit of thinking about yourself and thinking about your reality. So that's what I want to do. So one of the things he talks about is the idea of vertigo. Dizziness when you get up, in heights at the edge of the Grand Canyon or whatever. Where's vertigo come from? And here's what he writes about that. So I'm just putting this out there. You can think about it. He says, Kierkegaard is right. Anguish, we'll talk about that word again. Sartre uses it all the time. Anguish is distinguished from fear. Think of anguish as Heidegger's Angst, right? Anxiety. It's the same word. Anguish is distinguished from fear in that fear is fear of beings in the world, whereas anguish is anguish before myself. Like he could have cribbed that right out of Being in Time, right? Vertigo is anguish. Vertigo, that dizzy feeling at the edge of a precipice, is anguish to the extent that I am afraid not of falling over the precipice, but of throwing myself over. You hear that? When I feel vertigo at the edge of the precipice, why is that? I'm still 2 feet away from the edge. I am not going to fall off that cliff unless a big gust of wind comes up. But I just, I feel like dizzy with the heights. Sartre says that's because there's a worry that I might throw myself over the cliff. And I was like, I'm not feeling suicidal. I don't feel like I'm about to do that. A situation provokes fear if there is a possibility of my life being changed from without. I'm afraid if I hear somebody running at me when I'm near that cliff that they're going to push me over. My being provokes anguish to the extent that I distrust myself and my own reactions in that situation. Think about that. Think about that claim. That's a big claim. If he thinks there's a general kind of ontological insight to be drawn from this, what's he talking about? Well, in part, he's talking about the idea of that freedom, that the I that's standing there, the being that I have my concerns and my interests in, there's a part of that escapes. That non-positional, non-thetic consciousness of self, that radical freedom. There is nothing to prevent me from throwing myself over. Well, maybe I made a vow. Maybe I made a vow to preserve my life, like Kantian duty. I have a perfect duty to myself to preserve my life, if you remember Kant's moral philosophy, deontology. I have a perfect duty to preserve my life. So let's say I made a vow to do my duty no matter what, and my duty requires that I preserve my life. But I'm up there at the edge, and the vertigo comes because no matter what my vow might have been, I'm still free to throw myself over. And it's something I know about myself, Sartre wants to say. All right, well, let that percolate. What about the world? What about the what he calls fragility and just this thing when things get broken and destroyed? What's that all about? We have, let's say we have earthquakes or hurricanes or tornadoes. Things get destroyed. He thinks there's an insight here too. He writes, in a sense, certainly, man is the only being by whom a destruction can be accomplished. When an earthquake comes and all the buildings fall down, when a hurricane comes and wipes out all the houses, the earthquake didn't destroy, the hurricane didn't destroy. Sartre wants to say only humans destroy. Now, he's not saying the humans went out there with hammers, Heidegger's hammer, and smashed down all the houses. It's the being by whom a destruction can be accomplished. If there were no humans, if there was no consciousness, Sartre says before and after a hurricane, before and after an earthquake, there's the same amount of being in itself. It got rearranged. And even to say they got rearranged required a witness. And if there's no witness, well, there's nothing to be said. I should just not, I can't end the sentence. If there are no witnesses, right, there's nothing to say. It would take a witness even to recognize the rearrangement of being after an earthquake. When we say, oh, the town was destroyed, it's because we had interests and expectations about the town, about the buildings, about our shops and cars and so forth. So it becomes destruction because there's consciousness. Only through consciousness can there be destruction, because consciousness annihilates regions of being, saying this is not that. It does it based on its concerns and projects and expectations. And if an outside force rearranges things, then we take it as destruction. That's how destruction enters reality. And then he gives another example. What about a gambler who decides, you know what, I quit. Gambling's bad for me. It's bad. It's very risky financially. It's put me in bad relations with my family because I'm a gambler. I quit. I swear off. I'm not gambling anymore. And he says, well, what happens when the gambler gets, close to the casino again? What happens? Why does the gambler get so, stressed by the craps table and the roulette wheel? Why? Why? You made a vow. It should be, that's it. I am a non-gambler. I am a former gambler. I'm done. But the I that said that is not the I that's standing there in front of the roulette wheel. If you're going to make a vow not to gamble, you can't make it once and be done. That's not the way it works with consciousness. You can't make it once and be done. You have to make it always, all the time, every single time, because there is nothing that necessarily binds you to the you that last week made the vow not to gamble. So Sartre writes, what he apprehends then in anguish is precisely the total inefficacy of the past resolution. I'm not going to gamble anymore. It is there, doubtless, but fixed, ineffectual, surpassed by the very fact that I am conscious of it. The resolution is still me to the extent that I realize constantly my identity with myself across the temporal flux. But it is no longer me due to the fact that it has become an object for my consciousness. It has become positional consciousness. I think of myself as the non-gambler. But there's the non-positional, non-thetic consciousness of self that's free of that. That's kind of just observing that, if you want to put it in an Eastern philosophical kind of way. He talks about the alarm clock, and our book by Ben Argon talks about the alarm clock. Well, here it is. What about when that alarm goes off and I get out of bed in the morning? What's going on there? He says, the alarm which rings in the morning refers to the possibility of my going to work, which is my possibility. But to apprehend the summons of the alarm as a summons to get up, therefore the very act of getting up is reassuring, for it eludes the question, is work my possibility? Consequently, it does not put me in a position to apprehend the possibility of quietism, like doing nothing, of refusing to work, and finally the possibility of refusing the world and the possibility of death. In short, to the extent that I apprehend the meaning of the ringing, I am already up at its summons. This apprehension guarantees me against the anguished intuition that it is I who confer on the alarm clock its exigency, its demands. I and I alone. Now, a lot of words here, so let me get back. This goes along with the prior examples that we just were talking about. The alarm goes off, I get up. It says, go to work, get dressed, and go to work. So I get dressed and go to work. But in getting dressed and going to work, I put behind me, I hide from myself in a way, the fact that I'm giving the alarm clock its power. I hear the alarm clock, oh, the alarm clock says I got to go to work. Well, I don't have to go to work. It's a possibility for me. It's certainly one of my possibilities, but there are other possibilities, like not going to work, just staying in bed all day. I listen to the alarm clock. The alarm clock signifies, it means what it means, because I've conferred on it its power to get me going. And that's going to take us to a discussion of really, in a sense, what this whole Being and Nothingness book is about. The idea of what Sartre calls bad faith. So one more possibility before we get to that discussion is, what does he have to say about death as a possibility? Now, we learned from Heidegger, but he and Simone de Beauvoir differ from Heidegger. Heidegger's view, as you remember, is death is my own most possibility, which cannot be outstripped. No one can die my death for me. It's the possibility of no more possibilities. It's the horizon against my cares, concerns, and solicitudes for others makes any kind of sense or has any kind of meaning. Death is not just some event in the future, but it's a part of every care and concern that I have. It gives it its meaning, and he refers to that as our being towards death. It's an existential of Dasein, that we're being towards death. But Sartre thinks death is not a possibility of mine at all. Right? He didn't put it this way, but I would put it this way. It's not ever going to be the case where you're dead and you go, wow, I can't believe that possibility happened. That's wow, bummer, I'm dead. It's not going to be. When death and I will pass each other going through the door, as they say. It's not one of my possibilities at all. It doesn't figure in to my being for itself, Sartre says. Here's his words from Being and Nothingness. The perpetual appearance of chance at the heart of all my projects. Right? I got a project. I want to write a book, or I want to go hiking in the mountains or whatever, and something happens. I get an illness, or I die, or I get hit by a bus or something by chance, right? I didn't plan on it. It's not one of my projects, it just happens. So the perpetual appearance of chance at the heart of my projects cannot be apprehended as my possibility, but on the contrary, as the annihilation of all my possibilities. Annihilation which itself is no longer a part of my possibilities. Thus, death is not my possibility of no longer realizing a presence in the world, but rather an always possible annihilation of my possibilities, which is outside my possibilities. Now, if you unpack that, you might think, well, are they really that far different from each other, Heidegger and Sartre here? And I guess we could debate that or think about that a little bit. But I think what Sartre wants to say, and maybe I'm putting words in his mouth, but I think what he wants to say is you should almost put death out of your mind, right? What a for itself is, what a transcendence, what a human being is about projects. It's about expectation. It's about, using that power of annihilation, so to speak, of saying this but not that, of choice, of decision, in freedom, and with responsibility for those choices. That's what being a human is all about. And to sit around, thinking about what Sartre considers a chance event even though the chances, let's say, are 100%, it's still an external thing. It just happens. It's going to happen to you one way or another. Virus is going to get you, a bus is going to get you, a heart attack is going to get you, something's going to get you. It's outside of you. It's outside of your control. It's outside of your experience. You're not going to experience death, just possibly dying, if that's depending on what you do with that, with your projects. Once you get the bad news of a cancer in your body or something like that, that still becomes a possibility that you could develop projects around and so forth. So for Sartre, Beauvoir, there's something about life that somehow doesn't come through as strongly to me as in Heidegger. Sartre and Beauvoir really are talking about living a life of projects and possibilities and decisions and dynamism. Are they all that different? Well, maybe if we had more time, we'd think about that. But for Sartre, it's not a possibility. It's certainly not my own almost possibility. It's a matter of chance. It's an external, and therefore not really anything I have to deal with. When it gets here, but I won't be there to be bothered by it. All right, so what is this idea of bad faith? Bad faith is Sartre's word for inauthenticity. They're not exactly identical, what Heidegger meant by inauthenticity and what Sartre means by bad faith, but they are certainly related terms. So let's talk about that. The first thing Sartre mentions is when he's trying to tell you what he means by bad faith, it seems like lying to yourself. Classic examples are when anybody says, I had no choice, I had to blah, 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 whatever that is. I had no choice. Sartre says, you are choice. So to say you had no choice is just wrong. You say, well, I have to go to school. We talk like that all the time. I have to go to work. The alarm clock goes off. I have to go to work. Well, you don't have to go to work. You tell yourself you have to go to work, but you don't have to go to work. You say, well, I'll starve. Well, that's a possibility. Could be your choice. You could go to some other kind of work, or you could do something creative, or go be a gambler, whatever you want to do. It's a possibility. And you could own that possibility. Say, well, I had a lot of things, but I choose to go to work this morning. But people don't talk like that. They say, I couldn't be in class, professor. I had to go to a job interview. Well, you didn't have to go to a job interview. You chose to go to a job interview. You probably had pretty good reasons for picking that rather than coming to the class. But don't say I had to. Don't say I had no choice. I couldn't help it. Don't talk like that. Now, when you say that, it's not true. You're saying something that's not true. I had to. No, that's not true. I couldn't help it. No, that's not true. Well, Sartre likes to say, even on the rack, human beings are free. A rack is a torture device. They strap your wrists on one end, strap your ankles on the other end, and they lie you on this bed, and then they turn a crank which stretches you till you snap. It almost makes waterboarding sound kind of nice. All right, Sartre says, even on the rack, human beings are free. Now, again, that's something we can discuss, and whether we really think that, and whether he thought that his whole career, but at least in his early work, he believed that. So if you say, oh, I wasn't free, I couldn't help it, there was no choice, it's not true. So it sounds like bad faith is a kind of a lie. But can you really lie to yourself, right? In order to lie, you have to be conscious of what you're saying is not true and not a mistake. So if you say, well, what's the temperature? And I say, well, it's 67 this morning. And you say, well, I just looked at the thermometer and it's actually 77. I didn't lie to you. I was mistaken. I didn't tell you something I knew to be wrong. I told you what I thought was right. I wasn't lying. I was just in error. To lie, if I'm going to lie to you, I have to know what I'm saying is not true and hope that you don't know that what I'm saying is not true in order for that lie to be effective. And you probably talked a lot about that in your if you took a moral foundations course, you talked about lying and what Kant had to say about what Mill had to say about it. For lie to work, it requires that I know that what I'm saying is not true and hope that you don't know that, so I could pull one over on you. But then how could you lie to yourself? Think about that for a second. How could you lie to yourself? You know what you know. You can't tell yourself what you... The lie could never be effective for yourself because you're telling yourself an untruth, but you already know it's an untruth. So it doesn't work. Like if I tried to tell a lie to you and you say, that's not right, my lie didn't work. I had no effectiveness. That could happen, might not happen. I hope it doesn't happen if I'm trying to lie to you for my own benefit. But how can I lie to myself? I always know what I know. I always know what I'm doing, Sartre says. So you can't lie to yourself. Bad faith isn't a lie. Bad faith for him should be defined as fleeing anguish. Fleeing anguish. What is anguish? Anguish is freedom plus responsibility. It's Heidegger's idea of angst or anxiety, which is not just, as we learned, a medical condition, at least the way they look at it. It's a recognition of our being in the world, and our being in the world is without any kind of like cosmic backup. The meaning we make, and it might have been made otherwise. We chose to see the values and concerns of our lives the way we did, and we ought to be responsible. We are responsible for those choices to live a certain way, and that's what he means by anguish, and that's a heavy burden. Nietzsche calls it the greatest weight. It's a heavy burden, and as Heidegger said, it makes us uncomfortable, and we flee anguish. Heidegger says we flee into the they. Bad faith is our way of fleeing angst, fleeing the recognition of our own freedom and therefore our own responsibility for our lives. It's always going to be somebody else's fault. Society's to blame. It's my circumstance. I couldn't help. It's where I was born, or I got this problem, and there's nothing I can do about it. Sartre, at least in this early work, takes freedom to be absolute. He takes consciousness to be freedom. It's not like there's consciousness which is also free, has the characteristic of freedom. It is freedom, radical freedom, and therefore total responsibility. No excuses. That's the motto of Sartre. No excuses. Whatever's going on with you is a matter of your choosing, Sartre says. Now, he's not completely insane. He knows, if somebody fires you from your job, you're jobless. It may not have been your choice to be removed from your job. The virus came, there was no business, you had to be let go. That's part of your facticity. There's no question. Sartre does, he does recognize facticity. He doesn't think freedom is some kind of abstraction, but it's freedom within the context, freedom within what he calls a situation. We're free to deal with what being fired meant. Could mean one thing, could be another, and we're choosing what it's going to mean and how it's going to motivate us or demotivate us. We're responsible not necessarily for what happens to us, but for what we do in the light of what happens to us. And that's a heavy burden, and it's anguish, and we flee from it. We flee from it in bad faith by saying we couldn't help it. Sartre writes, it is in anguish that man gets the consciousness of his freedom, or if you prefer, anguish is the mode of being of freedom as consciousness of being. It is in anguish that freedom is, in its being, in question for itself. Right? Anguish is freedom recognizing itself as freedom and responsibility, and it's a heavy burden, and bad faith is our way of getting out of it. There's a whole section he writes about that in this gigantic book, big section called Freedom and Responsibility. You can check it out. So Sartre's pretty good at giving examples, so he gives you a few examples of what he's talking about here. So I can't go into all the details, but I'll just mention. So the first one he gives is the example of a woman who goes out with somebody for the first time. It's a guy in the example. She's in this date, and at a certain point, the guy kind of reaches over and reaches for her hand. All right. And now there's the question, what do I do? If I pull my hand back, it would say that I'm not interested in him, but I am interested in him. If I grasp his hand, then it would show that that I am interested in him, but then it might go too fast. I don't really know. So she basically just lets her hand sit there as if that would absolve her from the responsibility of either responding favorably or unfavorably to this guy's advances. And so he says that she's in bad faith. She's saying, well, it's not really up to me. We'll just let, nature take its course or whatever. That's trying to get away from her own freedom in that situation and a responsibility for what goes on in that situation. Okay, that's one example he gives. Then he gives another example of a waiter. He's watching a waiter in his cafe. It happens to be a guy, and he says, "Look at that waiter. He's doing everything in the waiter kind of way. He's moving exactly like a waiter would, and he's talking to people not as a person would, but as a waiter would talk to a person. And he's handling the plates and the silverware the way a waiter would do that." And you could almost hear Heidegger's like they self. He's waitering the way one does. He's waitering the way they say one ought to wait tables. And he says that the person thinks of himself as a waiter. Who are you? I'm a waiter. I'm your waiter. I am, right? My being is as a waiter. He says, no, that's you are taking on a role. You're playing a role. And then you're saying it's not really me that's doing this. It's the waiter is doing this. The waiter, okay, I happen to be playing that waiter, but it's the waiter that's doing this. It's as if the whole thing were kind of a movie. He says that's bad faith. And then he takes another example of, and you got to remember this, this book was written in the middle of the 20th century. Times have changed. We would probably talk about this or think about this differently. But he gives an example of a guy who's he's gay, he's homosexual, and he's racked with guilt. And so he, says something like, well, I'm not really homosexual. I've done a couple of things, but that's not really me. Yes, I've had a few relationships and, engaged in a few acts, but that's not really who I am. So Sartre says, well, that's bad faith. You're telling yourself something that not to be true. You're fleeing your freedom and responsibility for your behaviors and your actions and your choices. And then he says, and I think this is really interesting. He says, oh, well, the guy has a friend. And the friend says to him, you know what your problem is? You just are, you're not being sincere. You should admit to yourself that you're gay. You should admit to yourself you're homosexual. You should just admit it and just accept it. You should admit it and accept it. And so the person may take this kind advice from a friend and say, you know what? That's it. What I do because I'm a homosexual, because I am a homosexual. That's what I am. And because I am that, therefore I have to do like X, Y, and Z. That explains why X, Y, and Z happens in my life. And Sartre says, but that's bad faith too. That's just as much bad faith. In the first example, when the guy's in denial, he says, well, that's not, no, you that's you doing those things. Don't say that's not really me. That is you doing that. That's bad faith. But then and I think this is very interesting, Sartre and Beauvoir too really use a word that we think is a good word, and for them it's not a good word. They have a criticism, and the word is sincerity or seriousness. Either of those words. Now we would think, I think people should be sincere, and I think they should be serious. Those sound like good words. But Sartre and Beauvoir will say that actually can be a smokescreen for bad faith, when you just try to take yourself seriously as the waiter, and just say, that's what I am. That's not what you are. You are freedom. You've made choices to be a waiter, but you could choose otherwise. You could. And we can talk about this. We would have to talk about it. People have certainly talked about this from the time Sartre was writing, but he's trying to make a point. He's saying that even if it turns out to be that if you're homosexual, it's not a choice, it's a biological. Let's suppose that. Sartre always says, well, whatever, that's your facticity. It's a bell that can't be unrung, and that's cool. But what do you do about it? How do you live? What actions will you take? What choices will you make? What decisions will you stand behind? And that, he says, we're always free in. So if somebody says, well, I couldn't help it because I'm an XYZ, Sartre says, okay, maybe factically you're an XYZ, but that does not determine what you do. As I like to put it, facticity is not fate. It's not fate. So even if I try to be serious and say, oh, I admit it, I'm going to stand up, this is what I am, Sartre's going to say, no, still, it's not what you are, it's what you're doing, what you're choosing to do, what you're responsible to do. And I got nothing to say about that. I'm not criticizing. I'm just asking you to think about the fact that you're making choices in your life. You're making free choices, and you're responsible for those choices, whatever those choices might be. And I'm not here to tell you which choices you should make. I'm not here to say whether you should or shouldn't gamble, or be or not be a waiter, or be homosexual or not. Sartre's like, that's not what we're talking about here. I'm talking about, in a way, how you view yourself. Do you recognize your freedom, or do you flee from it, either in denial or in a kind of serious sincerity, which weirdly, paradoxically, maybe serves to absolve you from responsibility for your choices, which is, both of those, he says, are bad faith, So what have we learned so far? Just a quick review. There's 3 ontological categories that we've discovered. First, through the ontological proof, we've discovered that there is being in itself. Being just is what it is, trans-phenomenal being. And Sartre says it's utterly contingent. Being just is. There's no being behind being that brought being into being. No, it's just, it is. It is what it is. It just is. And it's like, Newtonian physics. It can neither be created nor destroyed, but just change from one form to another. And it would take a witness to recognize that. It just is what it is. And then we learned about being for itself. The being that, as he says many times in this book, the being that is what it is not, and that is not what it is. The being that is what it is not, and that is not what it is. And we have mentioned this. It's this sense that, okay, I'm a professor, but I'm my possibilities, and my possibilities are not yet. And I'm a professor, but I'm not that. I'm not only that. I'm not just that. I'm always more than that. There's always something that exceeds that or transcends that, for which in my freedom I'm responsible for, whatever that might be. Another synonym for this is transcendence, that goes beyond our labels and identities. And this being for itself is inextricably intertwined with the other kind of being, the being in itself. Consciousness, which is what transcendence or the being for itself is. Consciousness is always consciousness of something, and it's consciousness of being, of what is. And it's the annihilating power that raises figures from grounds, that allows there to be this rather than that allows there to be projects and concerns and responsibilities. But there's in our freedom. But there's a third ontological category, which you haven't really talked about very much, being for others. So we'll finish up our discussion of this big book, or at least our little pieces that we've highlighted here, by talking about that. It's the other that objectifies me. Not only do I objectify myself, but the objectifications I make of myself are a lot looser than the objectifications that others make of me when people put labels on me or name me or look at me in a certain kind of way. There is no problem of other minds as there is for Descartes. Just like Heidegger showed there was no problem of other minds, there's no need to prove that there's others, and Sartre will give you an interesting phenomenological example to prove that you don't have to worry about whether there's other beings out there or not. Not a problem. Are we talking about the they? When Sartre and Beauvoir, they have similar views on this. Are they talking about the they when they're talking about the other? We are going to talk later about a lengthy piece by Simone de Beauvoir called Pyrrhus and Cineas, and we'll come back to this when we get to her. So just a little heads up about that. She says that we esteem the they more than our own intimates. He talked about that again. If I wrote a book and my mom looked at it and she goes, "Oh, son, you wrote a book. This is a great book. It's a wonderful book." I could care less what my mom says about the book, right? But some stranger on the other side of the planet who reads the book and writes a book review of it and says it's a pretty good book. Well, I don't even know who that person is, but hey, they wrote a book review. That means something to me, even though there's this anonymous other that's giving me my esteem for the work that I've done, I don't know them, but still that seems to matter more than me. We take the advice, praise, blame of strangers more quickly from those we know. Like I said, my wife might have told me, 100 times, you really shouldn't eat all those pretzels that you like to eat. And I keep eating the pretzels. And one day I pick up the newspaper and says, hey, you really shouldn't eat pretzels. Honey, I'm getting rid of pretzels. I've told you that for 4 years now. You got to stop eating all those pretzels. Why is that? There's something about us that does that. And Beauvoir quotes this line, no man is a hero to his valet. What's a valet? You don't have one. I don't have one. A valet is the employee, the servant in your house that comes and dresses you in the morning. And you could be the great general or great head of state or whatever, but your valet has seen you in your underwear. I mean, they know, you put your pants on one leg at a time. You're nothing special to them. When they know you, right? Your reputation is among strangers, which is, kind of weird when you think about it. Other people matter to us, therefore, but it is complicated. We talked about Hegel. We talked about this idea of the dialectic, and that things are what they are as a function of what they're not. Things both are and are not what they are. We talked about that. And we talked about this example of master and slave. The master feels free over against the slave feels in bondage over against the master, but then the master has to keep guns and dogs because the master does recognize the slave is free to revolt, and the slave recognizes that the labor that's being provided and creates the master's wealth is actually done with the slave's own hands, and can revolt, and the master is caught up with the slave's continued willingness to not revolt. And the minute they revolt, the master is no more master anymore. So they are what they are as a function of each other. Sartre does a riff on this as well. He's getting it, like I said, from Hegel, who influenced Marx. Sartre has, if you wanted to, you philosophy majors, you want a good paper to write someday, you can write about this, the different views of like Hegel, Marx, and Sartre on this master-slave dialectic. And then Sartre adds in part 3 what he calls the look, le regard, in French, the look. We'll talk about that in a second. And then a very famous line from Sartre's play, No Exit, hell is other people. So let's just talk about a couple of these things here. The look, Sartre says nobody can be vulgar all by himself. What he means is vulgarity. You say that's a vulgar person. A person can only be vulgar if other people see that person as vulgar. If there's no one else around, it's like being in itself just is what it is. It's others who determine our identities for us in certain real ways. Shame, Sartre wants to say, in its primary structure is shame before somebody. Sartre tends to pick out examples that find us human beings not in our best light. And he's criticized for that, as we saw in the discussion of his public lecture, Existentialism as a Humanism. He tries to defend himself against that charge, but there is something to that charge. He likes to say things like shame is kind of a primary relationship between human beings. Well, he gives this example, again, another famous example I want to get out there in front of you. He says, picture a jealous lover in the hallway of of an apartment building, thinking that his beloved is in the room with somebody else, and he creeps up to the door and he looks in the keyhole. But if you've been to Europe, those old hotels, they have a big keyhole, and he could see through them and see into the room. And he's looking in the room, and remember, all consciousness is consciousness of something. So what's the jealous lover? What's the content? What's the positional thetic consciousness there? What's going on in the room? Not thinking about himself. He's thinking about what's going on there. What are they doing in there? What's going on in there? And what's going on in my relationship? What's happening in there? In there. And he says, now picture at the moment the jealous lover is looking through the keyhole. Somebody else comes walking down the hall. Somebody comes walking down the hall, and the person at the keyhole, the jealous lover, hears the footsteps and turns and looks and sees a stranger looking at him. sees the stranger looking at him, looking through the keyhole, and immediately shame, right? Immediately, like, hey, I'm not a peeping Tom. I'm not a jealous guy. I'm not that. I'm not really creeped out. You're trying every bit of, bad faith that you could come up with to flee from the anguish of recognizing that you chose to look through that keyhole. You chose to spy on your beloved like that. And the look of the other, you don't have a question whether that other is. You don't have a problem in other mind. You know from the look, the regard, as they regard you as a peeping Tom, as a shameful being. And you become a shameful being. You become that. You don't want to be that. There's a part of you that's rebelling about that. I don't want to be a shameful being, but the look of the other makes me that being. If you think about it in less dramatic circumstances, you can imagine that this happens all the time. I stand in front of a classroom and students objectify me. Students sit in front of me and I objectify them. That's the good student. That's the one who sloughs off or whatever. We put these labels on. We do this stuff to ourselves. We don't mean big harm necessarily by doing all that kind of stuff. We're not trying to create problems, but we do that. We are as people see that we are. And what Sartre wants to say is this shows us our situation. That's a very big, important word for Sartre, situated freedom. That's what we are. Situation reflects to me both my facticity and my freedom. So when the other gives me the look and they're seeing me and they're objectifying me and they're labeling me and they're naming me, that is part of my facticity. It's part of an unringable bell at that point. I am crouched over. I am looking through the keyhole. They are looking at me. They are labeling me. But if there weren't freedom, none of that would bother me. I wouldn't notice. I'm free of that, whatever that identity is that they're putting on me, whatever object they're trying to turn me into, and I'm letting them turn me into whatever that object is. In my freedom, I transcend that. I go beyond that. But I'm shackled with it because it also is part of my facticity. They saw me. I'm ashamed. I am ashamed. And I'm more than ashamed. I transcend it as well. And that's anguish, right? And so Sartre writes, just as the situation is neither objective or subjective, so it can be considered neither as the free result of a freedom, nor as the ensemble of constraints to which I am subject. Okay, what situation? It's not whatever you say it is. The free result of freedom at work. It's the situation, whatever I say it is. It's not that. And it's not just, all the constraints and the facticity all by itself, that the things that just happen to me. That's not either. It's the combination. It stems from the illumination of the constraint by freedom, which gives to it its meaning as a constraint. That goes back to what I was saying before. If you get a bad report from the doctor about your health, or you get let go of a job, okay, that's part of the constraint on your projects. You have things you want to do, and now you don't have a job, or now you're sick, or have to go to the doctor. Okay, but that doesn't determine. That alone does not determine your situation, and you can't just wish it away. I could freely imagine not having cancer or still showing up at my job, like Bartleby the Scrivener after he gets let go. He says, "I don't want to." It doesn't work like that. No, what happens is the constraints come, but freedom is able to give meaning to those constraints. What is it going to mean? Is this diagnosis going to shut me down forever? Or is this diagnosis going to get me to get up and go out in the world because I wasn't going anywhere, but now I might not have long to live, so I'm going to go do something? What is the meaning of that constraint? That's what situation is all about. Freedom in facticity. So I am seen by the other. I now exist as myself from my unreflective consciousness. I see myself labeled. It's a key point. Myself until this moment was a function of my reflective consciousness. I was thinking of myself as the professor, as the jilted lover, whatever. But now I am discovering a self the shameful self, the peeping Tom self, the jealous lover self. And I discovered that in the look of the other. How's that happen? Sartre writes, therefore, for the unreflective consciousness, the self exists on the level of objects in the world. This role, which devolved only on the reflective consciousness, the making present of the self, belongs now to the unreflective consciousness. Only the reflective consciousness has the self directly for an object. The unreflective consciousness does not apprehend the person directly as its object. The person is presented to consciousness insofar as the person is an object for the other. This means that all of a sudden I am conscious of myself as escaping myself. Not in that I am the foundation of my own nothingness, but in that I have my foundation outside myself. I am for myself only as I am a pure reference to the other. My unreflective consciousness, the watcher as I put it, the non-thetic, non-positional consciousness of self, is a nothing, right? Is a nothingness. It's annihilation that allows reflective consciousness to have an object. Think of myself as such and such. But now I'm discovering myself. I've become the object of my consciousness has been given to me by another in reference to how they've looked at me, how they regard me, what they think about me, what they're saying about me, how they're treating me. So what's hell? Hell is other people. A line from the play No Exit. You should check it out if you get a chance. Hell is other people. What does that mean? Freedom limits freedom. Sartre talks about, boy, Sartre, you're pretty negative when you say hell is other people. He said, well, I'm negative. Why don't you try the church? They say hell is a lake of fire and brimstone where you're tortured and burned without dying for eternity. That sounds pretty bad. What do I mean when I say hell is other people? They're freedoms too. They are transcendences too. They are for itself too. And in their freedom, they are free to look at me however they want, whether I like it or not, whether I want them to look at me that way or not. And that provides constraints on my life. When somebody tells me, you'll never learn math. Guess what? You'll never learn math unless you can find a way to break out of that. Right? You get labeled a certain way. You get told that you're a certain kind of person. And the next thing you know, you become that kind of person. But you're not that kind of person. You've accepted or allowed that to be the kind of person you thought yourself. You thought that you would look at yourself the way everybody else is looking at you. Sartre wrote a whole book about a French author who became a thief because when he was a little kid, he was rummaging around in his parents or grandpa, I can't remember, drawers and found something, took it, and got caught in the act. And mom or grandma or whatever says, "You're a thief." Told him, he labeled him, the regard. He looked at him as a thief. This is a kid, and he took on that identity and then became a thief. So, and that's what he means by hell. Hell is the inability to live out and express your own free projects. What's the main constraint? Not necessarily what's going on in nature, but what other people are doing, what their choices are, what their actions are, and especially how they're looking at us, how they're regarding us, how they're treating us. That's the trouble, the struggle of interpersonal relationships as Sartre sees them. He does not have a rosy view of interpersonal relationships. He doesn't. When Heidegger talks about the fact that our interpersonal relationships are colored by the they, he's not making big moral judgments about that. He certainly doesn't use the word hell. He just says that's how we get through the day. We do things the way one does things. We treat ourselves the way we're looked at, and do things the way one does, and we go and we get along, and that's the way to avoid, angst, because angst is troubling. That's what makes it rare. That's what makes authenticity, a real project. And most of the time we're inauthentic. Sartre puts a lot more moral weight on us, doesn't he, by saying hell is other people. All right, so some final questions from this talk, just again to put them out there, get you thinking about some things. This book is about bad faith. It's not there's nothing really in it about authenticity at all. We talked about why Heidegger had trouble talking about what exactly an authentic Dasein would look like, because it would be a freedom, and it's never been tried. Well, Being in Nothingness, doesn't add anything to that discussion either. It's a book, quite frankly, about what bad faith looks like, how to recognize it. So what would authenticity look like? Here's what he says, or maybe it's the most that he says. He goes, the authentic for itself, or what Heidegger called Dasein, or Sartre would also call transcendence, a freedom which wills itself freedom is in fact a being which is not what it is, and which is what it is not, and which chooses as the ideal of being what it is not, and not being what it is. Now, that's authenticity in the sense of owning it. That's the kind of being you are, and you should own it. You should say, I'm not what I am, even though I am what I am. It is facticity. I'm a prof. That's what I am, but I'm not. That's not what I am. I am and I'm not that. Right? And what I am is what I'm not yet, what I might be, what my possibilities are. Right? We talked about that, and I'm owning that. But, what does that even mean? And by the way, these are questions raised by Sartre. Right? What does that mean? Can one actually live like this? What would it take to live like that, to live with this recognition of yourself as freedom? And that means that you're never what you are, and you're always what you're not yet. Would it be is it ever going to be possible to fully escape bad faith, to falling into the trap of saying I am what I am? Not I am what I'm not, which would be the truth, would be authentic. But is it really possible to escape that trap, what he calls bad faith? Would you ever be able to escape situation? Remember, situation is that interplay of facticity and freedom. And then, he asks, will it situate itself so much the more precisely and the more individually as it projects itself further in anguish as a conditioned freedom and accepts more fully its responsibility as an existent by whom the world comes into being? In other words, could you do it? Could you situate yourself even more? Could you delve deeper into the world around you, your being in the world? All those things that we're calling constraints, which are mainly other freedoms, other for itself. Could we do that? Could we accept that responsibility? Will that happen? And he says, this is the question of ethics. The book ends with the idea that where we've gone so far in this gigantic book has taken us right up to the doorstep of the question of ethics. How is it best for us to be if this transcendence, this for itself, this being what it is not and is not what it is, that takes us up to the question of how is it best for that kind of a being to be? And Sartre says, I'll get to that in another work. And the fact is that he did not get to that in another work. There's a book that's been published in translation as Notebooks for an Ethics, which was published posthumously. That's his ideas for where this might go. But it's a tricky question, as I think you'll see, and we will certainly talk about that some more in future lectures.